Who arranged for our lunch today? Pastor? Well, can we express appreciation for the preparation of our lunch? Thank you, Pastor. Okay.
And then the girls that served.
Oh, yes. And for Amy, Willie, and
all the jelly beans.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks to all who helped make that happen. That's a great service to us. So we need to do the handouts that we're going to talk about. We're going to look at some of the documents, since this is nap time anyway, and give you a chance to rest your eyes a little bit. No, actually, we're going to look at some of the actual documents that we've proposed, and we'll look at different sections, and perhaps that'll evoke some questions too. So Pastor has them all printed off. He's just going to go retrieve them for us. While he's getting those, though, any questions left over from this morning that you can think of, you thought about during lunch? Yes? Where does the pastor's what? Oh, where does his vote come into play?
V-O-T-E?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you said vote.
Yeah.
I figured she meant V-O-T-E.
Both of them
Um,
are all three sent out?
Let's do just this so far. Thank you. First of all, he is a voting member of the congregation, so he does get to vote at the voters' assembly. But he only gets one vote, yes. And then as far as the church council goes, that depends on how you want to do it. Some churches have where the pastor does have a vote, some where he's a member but doesn't have a vote. So that's totally up to how you want to organize that. Yeah. Pardon?
The congregation sets that up.
Yeah, you'll see that in the bylaws. That's where you determine what he can do. So, in this sample here, I just want to take a quick look, make sure my page numbers are right. Page 2. Yeah, I think this is going to work just fine. So on page 2 is that same organizational chart that we looked at earlier. This would not be part of your actual constitution and bylaws. This is just preliminary information only as you're looking at it. And then on page 3 is actually page 1 of the Constitution.
Can I just ask you one question? Is that
Yes.
church administrator, is that a paid position?
Okay, the question is the church administrator a paid position? It'll depend on the size of your congregation and how you want to do that. We recommend for a sizable congregation that it be a paid position, but in smaller congregations, it's a volunteer position.
And so if it's a paid position, would it be a called position?
No, it is not a called position. And that's so that the council can either hire or terminate that position. That's a good question. In many congregations, and perhaps in a congregation your size, that could be a part-time position as well. It may not require full-time position. The church administrator, yeah, correct. And often where you find very qualified people is retired business people, men or women who have business background and are familiar with that. But you'll want to make sure that whoever that is it's a spiritually mature person. Because if you get somebody in there that has business experience but is not spiritually mature, they can create a lot of dissension in the church. So if you'll look, yes.
Just you might know this, but how do you vet these? I mean, you've got the Bible verses and Timothy or whatever, this shall be blah, 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 but how do you additionally vet somebody for this position?
Okay. That's a great question. How do you vet somebody for this position? It's like any other significant position. You have the job description, which, by the way, we'll be looking at the job description in the policy manual. So there's qualifications two ways. One is on their business and administration background, and the other is on their spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity will come through people that know God's Word well. They're not only in worship and communion regularly, but they're also in Bible study regularly. And you'll know who they are. That'll become very obvious. But that's one reason why the pastor also needs to approve of that candidate, is for the spiritual aspect. So the pastor would be, because he's the spiritual leader, would have the responsibility of looking at the spiritual maturity of that candidate. So we're not going to read this Constitution. I just want to highlight a few points. If you'll look on page 4, there's the Confession of Faith. That is already in your current set of Constitution and bylaws. It's actually in your Constitution. This is very important because it states right in your organizational structure, what do you believe? And what you believe in your current structure and in this one is that the Word of God is the only rule and norm of faith, but we believe that the Lutheran confessions are a correct exposition of that Word of God. And this is very important because this affects decisions that are made in the church. So for example, to put it in a very contemporary context, these particular articles guide you when you have a gay couple that wants to be married in your church. When you have people that want assisted suicide, is guided by this confession of faith. And so some very contemporary issues are guided by this particular article. So it's very significant. How many of you have a copy, not of the small catechism, but of the Luther's large catechism? If you don't have, to your pastors, one of the things we did a number of years ago in our church that I thoroughly enjoyed is during the Bible study, we went through Luther's large catechism. And it was written originally for leaders of the church, particularly pastors, for teaching their people, but it's excellent for lay people as well. And especially the section on the Ten Commandments and Confession and Forgiveness. Those two sections are my favorites of that particular book. It's a little bit thicker than the small catechism with explanation, but it's a very good book to get deeper into what did Luther teach. And then the one after that I would recommend is the Augsburg Confession. If you've never studied any of the confessions, those would be things that, for example, the elders could take a look at as well. Sonatical membership, as I mentioned earlier, the congregation is autonomous relative to the synod. What that means is synod cannot tell your congregation what to do. You're autonomous. But when you join the synod, you agree to a set of expectations in synod's constitution and bylaws. So they can't tell you what to do, but they can tell you if you don't abide by their expectations, you're no longer a member of synod. But they can't tell you what to do. They can only tell you whether you're a member, allow you to continue your membership. The biggest benefits of being a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is we come together with 6,100 other congregations so that we can educate our pastors and teachers and deaconesses and other professional church workers through our system of universities and seminaries, and that we can do mission work and human care work that we could never do on our own. So because you're a member of the LCMS, you help support mission work worldwide, including in this country, and human care work, where there are great human care needs. And those are the reasons we come together as a synod, is that as 6,100 congregations, we can do a whole lot more than we could ever do if we were just independent Lutheran churches. Next, it talks about congregational membership. It talks about baptized members, communicant members, and voting members. Then on page 6 is a section on called workers. It's just a brief description of that. It's actually pretty similar to what you have now, although it's written a little bit differently. Page 7, Article 7 is authority of and within the congregation. So the way we propose this is voting members are not voted in. If you're a communicant member of legal age in your state, you are a voting member. We don't make a distinction. Yeah, okay. I don't like the idea of having two separate organizations. So that's how that works. Meetings on page 8. This one says shall be determined as in the bylaws. Our suggestion is one voting meeting per year, unless, of course, you have special needs like a call meeting or something like that. Then the officers and boards. Officers are your typical chairperson, vice chairman, secretary, and treasurer. And then they correlate to what the state requires in a corporation. So you have president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary of the corporation. And then there's 3 different boards listed here: Board of Elders, Church Council, and School Board. And then the answer on the voting question, 9.3, the senior pastor is the called ecclesiastical supervisor of the congregation, shall be a non-voting ex officio member of all boards and their associated committees. So that would answer that question. Then you have to have a provision, what happens if the congregation dissolves. You currently have one of those as well, and amendments. And that's really all the Constitution has. By the way, when we put this together, I have looked at literally hundreds of different constitutions, bylaws over the years. And Synod has a model document on its website that we also looked at. And then when we drafted these, we did 2 things. We had our own district look at the model, and we also had an attorney look at the model. And we did that because that's what every congregation should have when you do a new constitution of bylaws. The district has to approve it before it's in effect. That's according to Synod's constitution of bylaws. But also, many congregations forget to have an attorney review them. Why is it a good idea to have an attorney review your revised constitution of bylaws? Legality? So you don't get sued, yeah. The law.
Make sure it complies with state regulations.
That's right. You want to make sure that you're complying with state statutes, and realize that over the years, the state changes those statutes. And people often forget to do that step. So even though we had a Montana attorney look at this, you'll want a Minnesota legal counsel to look at this. And it doesn't take a whole lot of their time or experience to do that. But there's certain things regarding announcements of meetings, voting, all of those kinds of things that you need to have in order to be in compliance with your state statute. So the bylaws then, notice at 1.1, the Congregational Assembly shall be the ultimate governing authority of this congregation. So that states what the ultimate authority is. And it talks about meetings and responsibilities of that voting board. Then Article 2 on the next page describes the Board of Elders. Article 3 on the page following is the Church Council. Article 4 is the School Board. By the way, you can call these boards different names if you like. So that is not a requirement to use this particular model. So you could actually call it the Preschool Board or Board of Young People's Education. I mean, you could call it whatever you want. The officers and their responsibilities are listed under Article 5. Under Article 6 are procedures for calling ministers of religion. And this is regulated very much by Synod's direction. When you agree to be a member of Synod, there's certain things that you agree to, so this is in compliance with that. By the way, when we took this model, I gave it to the Secretary of the Synod, who works with the Commission on Constitutional Matters for Synod, to have his review. And I also had it reviewed by a professor at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, who teaches governance in congregations. Interestingly enough, on his own, without talking to us, he advocates a 3-board model. And it was interesting how our notes really overlapped in his years of his work as well. Then nominations and elections, communications within the congregation under Article 8. If you only have a voters meeting once a year, it's important that you still communicate with the congregation. And you don't have to have a voters meeting to do it. So you can call it a town hall meeting or just an informal meeting, but it's good to let people know what is happening and to engage them in that. Finally, rules of order, and then amendments. And that's it for the Constitution and bylaws. Notice that there's not a lot of detail in there. It's just broad statements. Our philosophy is that in your bylaws, you don't want too much detail, because things that you'll want to change more frequently, you'll want to put in policies. You want your bylaws to be longer term and not something that you have to amend every year. Okay? So with that, let's look at some of these policy manuals. So if I could have help handing these out. We're going to hand out all 3 boards because we're going to be looking at all 3 of them. Yeah, but we'll do one at a time, but then could somebody hand these out on this side? Thank you. Okay, and this is the next one. Yep, this is the last one. Thank you.
It's called padding the books.
Thank you. So what you just received are 3 separate policy manuals. So rather than having one huge manual, they're divided into 3 manuals, one for each of the main boards. And we're just going to look at different sections together, and then I'm going to divide you up into 3 groups and have you look through some of the rest of the policies. So let's first of all pull out the Board of Elders Policy Manual. And if you'll turn to page 2, you might remember that I said that there are 4 basic sections in a governance policy manual. And on the table of contents, you'll see these 4 sections. Outcome policies, which is going to be the mission part, the ends statements. And then the next 3 are means. So Board of Elders, self-governance policies. It's how are we going to govern ourselves as a board. Section 3 is Board of Elders and senior pastor relationship. How do they relate? And Section 4, senior pastor limitation policies. So that's the way the policy manuals, all three of them, are laid out in terms of their organization. So if you turn to page 4, outcome policies, you'll see that it's blank. And that's because I can't write your mission statement for you. You have to write your own. But here's what I want to tell you about this one. This policy area, number 1, is the same in the Elders Manual as the Church Council Manual. So it's the council and the elders and the pastors that determine the mission of the church. And they write the outcomes policies together. And they're the same because they govern both areas the same way. In other words, everything that the council does and everything that the elders do and everything that the pastors do needs to fit inside that big bowl. That's what section 1 is. It's the big bowl. And they're defining that. Now, the school policy has its own big bowl. So its mission is going to look a little different, but guess what it has to fit inside? The big one. And here's why this is important. Many education ministries at churches, preschool, early childhood education, schools, etc., kind of start doing their own thing and may not even be a part of the big bowl. So I'll give you an example. I worked with a church where they had a preschool, and they hired a preschool director who was Jewish. By faith, she was a Jew. But on the sign outside, they advertised they had a Christian preschool. And nobody in the church had a problem with hiring a Jewish woman as a director. What's the conflict?
You got Jews and Christians, right?
But she could have been a Jew for Christians.
But she wasn't. She was a Jewish woman by faith. Nobody had a problem in the church with that until she became pregnant because she was single. The conflict in the church was, should we keep a single woman who is pregnant as director of our preschool? It wasn't, should we keep her as director since she doesn't even believe in the same faith as we do?
Your priorities are all screwed up.
So I asked the church, I said, you're advertising a Christian preschool, but you have a Jewish director. And I said, why are you doing that? And they said, you don't understand. They said, the preschool generates revenue that supports our budget. We couldn't exist as a church if we didn't have that preschool. I said, why don't you buy a bar or a casino or a hardware store? You see, running a preschool that's not Christian is not part of this bowl. They had a mission problem. And so your school, your preschool, needs to fit inside the mission of the church. So what the policy says is the school board determines this mission, but it has to fit inside this mission bowl. And in fact, it has to be approved by the elders and council. The elders and council don't write the school's mission, but their mission has to be approved by them to make sure it fits in the church. Does that make sense? Now, I gave you perhaps an extreme example, but there are other examples where schools have become so separate that they're not part of the church anymore. And I'm working with another church right now where the school has taken off in its own direction, and it's doing things that are not consistent with the mission of the church.
I'm just trying to wrap myself around this. So at a really rudimentary level, have an annual meeting. You review these goals that are set so you know if you are achieving the outcome that you want. Do you follow me, Ted?
Mm-hmm.
So what are our goals? Well, I mean, I know what our mission of our church is. Everybody knows what our mission of our church is. But should it be broken down? You're the only one that I've ever seen call that out in your book where you talk about attendance. You know, hey, if you're not going to come to church, if you're not going to come to Bible class, you know, and that's a great way to vet somebody. I get what you're saying now about vetting somebody. How can you have somebody that doesn't even, you know, isn't even there on a regular basis? You know what I mean? So you follow where I'm confused?
Yeah, there's actually a couple of parts to your question. So let's go back to the Constitution for a moment, the bylaws. I've got to find where I'm looking for it here. I'm still looking. I'll let you know here in a second. Okay, page 17 of the bylaws. 7.2. All nominees shall be chosen for spiritual maturity, quote, full of the Spirit and wisdom, Acts chapter 6, verse 3, which shall include regular attendance in worship, communion, and Bible study. Except for the one school board member who is not a member of the congregation, all nominees must be voting members of the congregation. And then members of the board of elders, congregational chairman, and vice chairman must be male. You'll see that that's in accord with Synod. And then other qualifications may be established by each board in its policies. So there it's briefly described. But now let's look at the policy manual. The elders, page 11. So you can see the bylaw was fairly general, but then the policy expands on that. So under qualifications for elders, 2.2, as leaders in sample church, elders need to meet qualifications as identified in Scripture. And so the Scriptures are fully written out here. We're going to be looking at these tomorrow morning in Bible class, by the way. Exodus 18, 19 through 23. Jethro instructed Moses on what he should do as a spiritual leader to the people and how to appoint qualified people. So the text is right there. Notice in the bold part, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe. Those are the qualifications. Policy 2.2.1.2 on the next page. Acts 6, verses 3 through 4, the qualifications, men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom. The next policy, 2.2.1.3, 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 13, and these are qualifications for deacons in Paul's letter to 1 Timothy, and the bold there is there. And then 2.2.1.4 from Colossians 3. So the Scriptures are identified very specifically in the policy, fully written out, with the qualifications spelled out. Then, on the next page, 2.2.2, accordingly, elders of sample church need to be known as spiritually mature Christians, full of the Spirit and wisdom, forgiving as Christ forgave them, demonstrating brotherly love, letting the peace of Christ rule in their hearts. All of these are coming from those Scriptures that were just listed. And then 2.2.3, no one shall be allowed to be elected or continue serving unless he demonstrates spiritual maturity. How do you define that? The policy defines it. Number 1, attending worship services at least 75% of the weeks. Number 2, participating in the Lord's Supper at least 12 times a year, etc. So they're listed out there. Now, as policies, you can amend these every meeting if you want. So the bylaws don't have this detail. The bylaws just say they have to be spiritually mature, regular in worship attendance, communion, and Bible study. Then the policy spells out what does that mean. So there you have the specifics. And then you also have how correction is made in number 4. Mark, does that answer that part of the question? The other question you asked was,
Well, so now, you got halfway there, so now, come back to your big blank page of your outcomes. So, do we review these outcomes?
oh, reviewing the outcomes, yes.
Go up to your end, do a report on the outcomes, or, because that's no good until you get your report there.
Right. So outcomes are not the same as goals. You write goals to achieve your outcomes. So what I mean is this. An outcome is this. Who will be changed and how will they be changed? Non-believers will become Christian. That's a description of somebody who will be changed. Believers will grow in their spiritual maturity. That's an outcome. How will people become Christian? How will they grow? That's means. How they become Christian is through evangelism, through teaching, through baptism. How will they grow in their faith? Through attending worship, through attending Bible study, through study of the Word, through spiritual care. Those are means by which people will become disciples. Okay? But just because they're outcomes and not goals doesn't mean that they shouldn't be reviewed. So these three boards need to review that mission at least annually and be talking about it regularly. So go back to that Elders Policy Manual on page 6, 1.4.1. The Board of Elders, Senior Pastor, Church Council, and Church Administrator shall work together to define, review, and maintain the outcome policies. The entire Section 1 shall be the same in the policy manuals of the Board of Elders and the Church Council. And that's because they're working in the same church. The Senior Pastor, serving together with the Board of Elders, shall be primarily responsible for achieving the spiritual aspects of the outcome policies. The church administrator serving under the church council shall be primarily responsible for management in the areas of finance, property, risk, human resource, legal, and social ministries to support and achieve the outcome policies. Those are brief descriptions of their two job descriptions related to achieving the vision or the outcomes. Then the school. 1.4.2, does the congregation ever have input? The congregation in its official meetings has ultimate governing authority. Thus, the congregation shall be given authority for final affirmation of outcome policies 1.1 and 1.2 and any subsequent changes. So it goes back to the congregation for their final review. So the working part comes from the boards and the staff, but the final approval is by the congregation. But then 1.4.3, the school board shall work together with the principal or director to define, review, and maintain the outcome policies of the school board. But, point 1, the outcome policies of the school board are subject to and must coordinate with the outcome policies of the Board of Elders and Church Council. Thus, the Board of Elders and the Church Council shall be given opportunity for final approval of the school board's outcome policies and any changes made. That's so that the school's bowl always fits inside the church's bowl. Okay? And that's to help keep it all coordinated and together. I think, does that answer your other question then? Very good question. Yes? Neither. It is not based off of yours. It's based off of this new model, but it incorporates aspects of Synod's model, like what's required for calling church workers.
The reason why I asked is when we read under Article 7, 7.2, where it said the nomination for the Board of Elders, Congregational Chair, Congregational Vice Chair must be male. That was without question, because I know under the Synod, the only one that has to be male is the Board of Elders.
If you look at, so if you look at that, you're looking at 7.2. 7.2 of the bylaws. If you look, there's a footnote there that documents where that came from. Regarding the requirement that the congregational chairperson and vice chairman be male, congregations considering changes to their constitutions and bylaws are encouraged to study the LCMS most recent documents regarding the role of men and women in the church. So the CTCR has several documents on that. I'm sorry, that's Commission on Theology and Church Relations. Some congregations may determine that these two positions do not meet the standards necessary for limiting the positions for males. So it depends on how you do that, but that's our recommendation. So that's where it came from. That's a great question. Very insightful. But notice this, in the end, who makes that decision? The congregation. But you follow the guidance of Scripture of the Synod because you are members of the Synod.
And this has to be approved by the
District.
district,
Right.
which is part of the Synod.
Right. So district is Synod in this place.
Right.
In southern Minnesota, that's Synod,
Yeah.
is your district. And by the way, I made just a friendly visit to your district office yesterday afternoon when I was here in town. You have some great people working for your district. You have really great resources. So yes, Synod is that. And so one of Synod's requirements in its constitution and bylaws is that all congregational constitutions and bylaws must be approved by its district. And the reason is twofold. First of all, they want to make sure that there's nothing that's really a problem legally. They're not responsible for having it looked at legally, but some congregations put things in there that aren't wise. And secondly, to make sure that it's consistent with Synod's constitution and bylaws and articles of faith. And so that's why they look at that. All right. Yeah, that's all right.
Emotionally charged, I'm sure most of these that you've done in these churches are emotionally charged issue. What do? Draw up a flow chart and try to counsel with these parties that are disagreeing and then hoping that they see this whole process and it goes well? You understand what I'm saying? It's pretty complicated, for your average person. Would you not agree?
I would agree, and that's why we've developed sample documents for you to follow. And they can be issues over which people have passionate disagreements.
Right.
So later today, we're going to talk about what you need to do to move through this process to prepare for that.
Okay.
And the other thing that I would suggest, although I think you've already studied that in your Bible class, you went through Go and Be Reconciled, didn't you?
Yeah.
We recommend that you as a congregation study how do we as Christians deal with our disagreements. So most of the congregations that are going through this proactively like you, there might be disagreements, but people don't get really overly passionate about it. But that's if you follow our suggested process, which is taking time to go through it, letting people have their input, responding to it appropriately, taking time to make it, because it is a major change. Especially if you go from 7 boards to 3 boards, it's a pretty significant change. Plus, going from managing boards to governing boards is also a significant philosophical change. Okay, so let's turn to section 2, Board of Elders Self-Governance. And this is similar in the other one as well. The other 3, they all have these similar things. But 2.1 is another one of these policies that is the same in all 3 manuals. And that's because it describes the division of governance, authority, and responsibilities. And so the school board, the council, and the elders need to come together if they're going to make changes to this particular section. So it says that the governance and authority shall be divided among 3 boards: Board of Elders, Church Council, and the School Board. The policy on division of governance and authority shall be the same in all 3 policy manuals. That's what 2.1.1.1 is. And they'll agree on any changes made to this policy, so that's the same in all 3 manuals. So then it lays out who works with which staff member. So 2.1.2, assisting the pastor in the oversight of the doctrine, life, and spiritual well-being. The Board of Elders shall have authority and be responsible for governing spiritual outcomes. Notice that it recognizes the authority of the pastor, his spiritual authority, in his call document. And then it talks about those things. So here's the job description of the Board of Elders. In the bylaws, it just said to be responsible for the spiritual life of the pastor and his family and the congregation. Here it's spelling it out in more detail. Evaluating and monitoring spiritual teaching and ministries of the church and school ministries. Noticing that the school ministry spiritually comes under the pastor and the elders. Next, appointing the call committee. Next, arranging for temporary services in the case of the senior pastor's unavailability or vacancy. Next, on behalf of the congregation, evaluating and monitoring the performance of the senior pastor. Next, providing for the spiritual, emotional, physical, and well-being of the pastor and his family. Adopting policies for achieving spiritual outcomes, and so on. So this is their brief job description. Then on page 2.1.3, the church council shall have authority and be responsible for governing the business functions and social ministries of the church. Social ministries, by the way, could either go under the church administrator or the senior pastor. You could do that either way. We've chosen in our model to put it under the council. Excuse me. So recruiting, selecting, appointing, or employing by contract the church administrator with the concurrence of the senior pastor. So there you see the church council has the full authority to hire or terminate the church administrator, but in order to hire somebody, the pastor has to agree with the person. So the pastor doesn't make the decision, but he can veto any decision. And the reason is because of the spiritual aspect of that position. Then it talks about things like fiscal management, property management, risk management. Risk management is looking at all your insurance contracts, for example. HR, which is human resource. So notice that when we get to the church council, the employee policies are not in this policy manual. They develop a separate employee policy manual, but that comes under the church council, who delegates that to the church administrator. Legal affairs management, social ministries. Then jointly with the Board of Elders, recommending the annual church ministry plan and summary financial budget to the Congregational Assembly. So going back to Mark's question earlier about should you be reviewing the outcomes annually, the answer is yes, especially when you're looking at what happened last year and what you're going to do next year. Because you see, your budget should not be based on what you spent on money last year. Your budget should be based on how are you going to fulfill your mission this year. So the ministry plan is how are we going to make disciples? And what money are we going to spend it on? And so that's where the annual review with the congregation comes. So that means the boards have to do their work before they come to the congregation, reviewing those outcomes, making sure the right ones, and that they achieved them last year and what they're going to do differently to achieve them this year. Okay? So then the school board shall have authority and responsibility under 2.1.4. I'm at the bottom of page 10 of the Elders Manual, evaluating and monitoring the teaching ministries of the school, and so on and so forth. So they have their responsibilities. So that particular policy is the same in all 3 policy manuals. Now, when it comes to most of the rest of the policies, they're going to vary depending on that board. And in a minute, I'll break you up in different groups and you can start looking through those. But there's one more that's the same.
Why do you have these in both, in 2 different places? Why don't you have one place that defines these
and then you can refer to them in the policy for elders and the education and council and so on.
So that's a great question, and if you wanted to, you could separate them, but I'll tell you why we did it separately. We did it separately because those boards will always have their policy manual in front of them, but not always a general one. And it also forces them to come together to work on the joint ones.
I would hope there'd be some other ways that we could force that besides just having it printed in a manual, but.
Right. It keeps primarily it keeps it in front of each board. But you could put them in a separate manual if you wanted to. There's one other area that is like that, and I'm just looking for it in here. It's conflict of interest policy. Pardon? Page 40. Of which document? Yeah. There it is. Thank you. Thank you, Bethany. Page 40 of the Elders Policy. This is a detailed conflict of interest policy, and you'll see the first policy is that this is the same in the policy manuals of elders, council, and school board. Conflicts of interest have been the source of many disputes in congregations we've worked with over the years. And essentially, what you're doing is describing what those conflicts are going to look like. And it's not that you aren't going to have conflicts of interest. You are, just because you're a close group of people. What's important is that you disclose them and everybody's aware of them and how you're going to act differently because of them. For example, let's say that you have an elder whose wife is the janitor. That's a potential conflict of interest. Or let's say you have a council member who owns a business that's going to be providing snow removal services for the church. See, that's a conflict of interest. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have that, but it means that everybody needs to know what those conflicts are. And when it comes to voting on those issues, the person that's in the conflict is removed from the decision-making process. And that's essentially what these policies attempt to do, is lay those out. So obviously you can change them to however you want them, but it's very important that you do that. Now, as a church, you do not have to file a 990 form with the IRS. 990 is what the Internal Revenue Service requires of nonprofits, except it doesn't require it of churches. It's instead of an income tax return, it's called the 990 nonprofit return. I'm getting affirmation from Linda here this morning. She knows, or this afternoon.
Unless you have non-related business.
Unless you have non-related business income, yeah. Let's say that you had a house that you were renting next door. That would be a non-related business asset. In the 990, you are required by federal regulation to have conflict of interest policy. And the church doesn't usually file a 990, so they don't think about it. But this gives you a format to start from. And again, you can vary it however you want it. But this just spells out what is a conflict of interest, what does it look like, and how are we going to handle it when it occurs. And they do occur. Yeah?
So the disclosure helps with the unity of the church?
Yes, it does. Okay. And I'll give you an example. Recently, I was asked to do a mediation. I've been nominated to do a mediation for a case with a non-Lutheran school. It's an independent Christian school in another part of the country. And the dispute is between a teacher and the school leadership because the teacher was recently terminated. The teacher's last name is the same last name as a friend of mine in Portland, Oregon. And this is on the East Coast. I have no idea if they're related or not. But I disclose that. I have a friend that has the same last name as the teacher. They may disqualify me because of that, but that's their privilege to do that. I don't think it would cause any problem in me being a mediator on the case, but I disclose it and I leave it up to the rest to decide whether it's a problem or not. So that's an example. If you just disclose it, then you don't have any surprises. Last year I did an arbitration, and we had a panel of arbitrators. There were 3 of us on this arbitration panel, and it was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit case. And in the middle of the mediation, it was discovered that one of the arbitrators knew one of the witnesses, but hadn't disclosed it because she didn't think it was important, and it became a major issue in the case. It eventually got resolved and worked out. The point is you want to disclose any potential conflicts of interest beforehand, and then people can make a good decision whether it's an issue or not. So that's kind of what the policy does. And then with that policy, at the back of the policy manual on page 51 is the conflict of interest disclosure form. And so you put down your disclosures in writing. When I was on Synod's board of directors, every board member, every staff member had to fill one of these out every year because there's obviously going to be several conflicts of interest. One of the ones that I filled out when I was on Synod's board of directors is that I was president of Ambassadors of Reconciliation. And sometimes we do teaching for the Synod or the districts. Sometimes we do reconciliation work for the Synod or its districts or one of its entities like a university or seminary. And so I had to disclose that. And what happened one year was we were working with a congregation that had multiple lawsuits for sexual misconduct. And when I say we, I mean Ambassadors of Reconciliation was working with this congregation. We were proposing to do mediation and, if necessary, arbitration in some of those lawsuits. But because I was on Synod's board of directors, I had access. In fact, we got reports of all of Synod's legal side of that lawsuit, because when somebody sues a church, they sue the district and the Synod at the same time. And that's when I resigned from Synod's board of directors, because I said I cannot have Synod's side of the lawsuit if they're going to be one of the parties that we're going to mediate or arbitrate. And the rest of the board didn't agree with me. They said, we can just excuse you from that part. And I said, well, but we're going to be working with other churches and entities. I just don't feel it's right for me to be in that position. So I removed myself from Synod's board of directors because of those lawsuits. So that's just an example of conflicts of interest and how you have to address them. Most of you have probably not had to deal with that kind of thing before, but you're a significant sized congregation with a school, and this is an important part of what you need to do. Here's the good news. You have a model to start with where you don't have to write it from scratch if you want to use it. Any questions on the conflict of interest policy and its purpose? All right, so here's what I want to do. I've just shown you the common policies in the 3 policy manuals. The rest are unique, but they have similar formats. So what I'd like you to do is self-divide into 3 groups. Groups that want to look at the Board of Elders policy manual, groups that want to look at the council policy manual, and groups that want to look at the school board policy manual. You've got all 3 manuals. I'd like you to just meet in your different groups and just kind of go through the sections, and I will stop and visit with each of the separate groups. But I just want you to look through, take a, like in the elders one, take a look at section 2.2. It's qualifications for elders. We kind of went through that one, okay? 2.3, accepting responsibilities. Pick a couple of those to look at. 2.4, governing policies and values. 2.5, etc. By the way, on the elders, it'll be really important to look at, we have things on church discipline. By the way, your policy manual actually had some policies on that. I cannot tell you how rare that is. I commend you. Somebody was thinking ahead on that. We have a very detailed area on that because of the significant issues it causes, both in terms of lawsuits as well as conflicts in churches that end up being appealed to synod. So that would just be an example. If you're the elders, I'd recommend that you look at some of those. Council, look at those, and school board, look at those. So, Pastor Dan.
What do you want the people on Zoom to do?
Oh,
We have
do they
some-
have the manuals in front of them?
We've got 4 on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on Zoom here. And did Sally send that out?
Yeah,
So they have it electronically.
yes.
And so, does somebody from online want to let us know what you want to do?
Yeah, what? Yeah, can you put them in a breakout room and have them look at just one set?
Okay, they weren't talking. I can put them in a breakout room, sure.
Yeah, have them go in a breakout room, and I don't know what the mix of those 5 people are, but have them choose just one of the manuals to take a look through.
Okay, I will do that.
Thanks for the question. So, school board people, how about if we have you meet over here? And Board of Elders here. And people that want to look at the council manual, do we want to send them to the lounge?
They certainly can.
Or do you want to, if you want to stay back here, you can meet back here too. Let's do that. So just go ahead and get into one of the 3 groups. Doesn't matter if you're on one of those boards or not. Just I want to give you some time to look through the policy manual.
Hey, Bethany. Do you know how to do breakout rooms? Do you know how to do breakout rooms?
No, it is in one of your printed.
Let me take a quick look here. Let's take about 15 minutes. 15. Pardon? Yeah, you should do elders.
That you mentioned capitalizing equipment. Prior to my taking over treasurer, they hadn't capitalized anything, so we finally got that going. And our balance sheet looks really
That's what I would do. There's no point in sending them to.
So folks that are on Zoom, we're just going to unmute you on the Zoom call, but we're going to mute you for the sanctuary so nobody can hear you. And go ahead and talk amongst yourself, okay? Hey, guy. For those on Zoom, we will be taking a break here in 2 minutes.